Thank you very much, and thank you. It's a privilege to be here to moderate the final panel. And what I like about final panels, after 2 days of exploring all the issues, you guys have one simple question to answer. Can the Russian people be free? So I'll expect yes or no answers from you, right? We have a wonderful panel here. We have two over. I'll just go in the order the people will be speaking. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is well known to many of you. He is now coordinator of Open Russia, which is a platform for pro-democracy activists. But he also, even though he was only born in 1981, which brought me up short since that was the first time I was assigned to Moscow for Newsweek. And if I saw you, it was in one of those prams.
We may have met sometime, I was just about to say.
Yes,
you never
right.
know.
Has already a long first journalistic career and political career working with people like Vladimir Bukovsky and Boris Nemtsov, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen his writings, his commentary, and I think he represents certainly a new generation of politicians, activists, writers, which is very relevant to this discussion. Next, we have Mark Galeotti right here to my right. He is a senior researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague, where he coordinates the Center for European Security. I found some wording on one of your bios, which I thought was particularly nice. He says, he specializes in the murky subjects of Russian politics, history, and security affairs, and transnational and organized crime. Murky subjects is a nice way of putting that. And Mark has been writing extensively, is constantly pivoting between the academic world and the world of think tanks and governments, and brings a very broad perspective to these subjects. And then we have Arkady Ostrovsky, who is the Russia and Eastern European editor for The Economist, who was Moscow bureau chief for The Economist before that, and worked for the Financial Times covering Russia before that for 10 years. Many of you read about, I think, the excellent reviews of his book, The Invention of Russia, The Journey from Gorbachev's Freedom to Putin's War. And he also is very often, you can hear him on the BBC, NPR, and other stations. So, and I should add, unfortunately, we were going to have a fourth panelist, Paul Goebel, but he had a family emergency and regretfully had to back out today. But we have plenty to talk about, and I just mentioned very briefly, you know, this issue of can Russians be free is not certainly a simple Putin-era question. It's a question I think every journalist, diplomat, academic who's gone to Russia and for decades, even sometimes centuries, has talked about. I remember when I was going there for the first time in the early 80s, if I went through my reading list, there were some of the standard reading like Marquis de Custine, A Journey for Our Time, the French aristocrat who went to Russia and traveled famously there in the early 19th century, and who observed about, who wrote extensively about the despotism of that time. And in fact, he even coined a phrase about Russia, which I heard Yelena of Memorial mentioned in a previous panel about how fear replaces thought. And that's an ongoing idea that keeps coming up. There was, my other parts of my reading list were something like Russia Under the Old Regime by Richard Pipes, who was the historian who made it sound like many people read that and said, well, Russia has always lived with tyranny, and there are no restraints on on state institutions and state leaders. But on the other hand, Pipes was also on part of the Reagan administration. I met him before going to Russia, I remember, in the National Security Council. And they are very much of the mind that this administration is going to do something different. And on the premise that there will be Russians who will welcome change, who will want to change, and they need support. And so you had that part of the debate, and you also had the people who were the visionaries, Andrei Amalrik, will the Soviet Union survive until 1984? I remember also in Solzhenitsyn writing in Foreign Affairs in 1980, a rebuttal to kind of the view that Russians cannot live with freedom, and making the case that the whole concept that it's only lived with tyranny as a misunderstanding of history, particularly the late Tsarist era, when many institutions and many individuals spoke out and began to operate in a far more free context by comparison to the system that would follow. And then, of course, we went through these various periods, the late 80s, early 90s, under Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, where at least for a while, you could ask the question, and I was back in Moscow in the beginning of the 90s, and people would ask a question, and it didn't sound like a stupid question: when will Russia become a normal, boring country? That at least there's a possibility of that. Well, right now that seems very far away. But that's sort of the question that I think we're faced with on this final panel. And yeah, I'll just say that one way, there's always this pressure to try to predict the future in Russia. And one way some of my colleagues and I would try to fend off our editors who would try to get us in every piece to say, okay, so what's happening next, whether this was the Soviet era or the post-Soviet era, would be to refer to the changes not only of the present situation, but in the views of the past situation, and saying, how can we tell the future in a country with an unpredictable past? That I think still holds, but I think I'd still like all of you to give this a stab. So Vladimir, if you could start us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I want to extend my gratitude once again to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Hoover Institution for organizing and hosting this two-day thorough discussion about a century of Russian history. And as Andrew said, this is the final panel, so we are dealing with the latter part of the subject of this conference. Russia is a country of symbols. And after defeating the attempted hardline coup d'etat by the communist and KGB hardliners in August 1991, when hundreds of thousands of unarmed people went to the streets of Moscow and literally stood in front of the tanks that the coup leaders had sent into our city, crowds began to gather on Lubyanka Square, just across the street from the KGB headquarters and by the monument to its founder, Felix Dzerzhinsky. For decades, the 19-foot-tall bronze statue of the man who had established a system of terror that has claimed millions of lives stood on one of the main vantage points in Moscow overlooking this square. And after defeating the system, it was important to remove the symbol of the system. And I think that image of the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky hanging in a noose as a crane lifted it up from its pedestal on the evening of 22nd of August 1991 will remain one of the most enduring images of the Russian democratic revolution. I think if somebody told the crowds gathered on Lubyanka Square that evening that just 8 years later, an officer from the very same organization they had just defeated would become president of Russia, few people would have believed it. Vladimir Putin began with the symbols too. In one of his first acts in office, in the first year of his presidency, against vehement protests from Russia's cultural intelligentsia, and his own predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, who had put him in the Kremlin, and the liberal opposition in the Russian parliament, that's when we still had a real parliament back then, Mr. Putin reinstated the music of the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. As I noted already, Russia is a country of symbols, and the message was unmistakable. There were many reasons, I think, for what in 1991 seemed such an unlikely course of events. The principal mistakes, I believe, were made early on, and they were made by Russia's own democratically elected leadership that was unwilling or unable to go through with a fully fledged process of decommunization that happened in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and that would have made it impossible, or at least much more difficult, for the old system to make a comeback in any form. The Soviet regime remained only half condemned. Some of the Central Committee and KGB archives were opened, but not fully and not for long. The repressive nature of the old regime was officially recognized, both by the Russian parliament and by the Russian Constitutional Court, but no illustrations followed against the people who had perpetrated those repressions, communist apparatchiks and KGB operatives. As prominent Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza warned at the time, in 1991, responding to that often used phrase by the opponents of lustration about a witch hunt, Kara-Murza said, if we don't hunt the witches are going to come back and hunt us. And that is, of course, exactly what happened just 8 short years later. The genuine economic difficulties in the Russia of the 1990s, some caused by the legacy of Soviet rule, some by global economic circumstances, some by the mismanagement of the Russian government itself, certainly created a fertile ground for a revanche by the old system, or at least the elements of the old system. And I think it's important to note that Western leaders made mistakes too. And I think the principal one of those was that unlike our neighbors in Eastern and Central Europe, Russia was never really offered a full path of European and Euro-Atlantic integration that served as such a powerful incentive for reforms in other post-communist states. All of these reasons are important with varying degrees. I think they're all valid, and they should all be studied and analyzed, not just for the sake of historical interests, although that is very important in itself, but also in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes the next time Russia embarks on a democratic transition, which it will sooner or later. But there is one quote-unquote reason that is sometimes offered as the explanation that I think lacks any validity at all. And that is that tired old stereotype that Andrew referred to in his introduction, that Russians are somehow just unsuited for freedom, for democracy, and for the rule of law. That after brief experiments with these notions at the beginning and then at the end of the 20th century, they just went back to their natural way of living under a strong hand. This stereotype is superficial. As a Russian, the stereotype is insulting. But most important of all, the stereotype is not true. As a matter of historical record, as opposed to stereotype, every time the Russian people could actually choose in a more or less free election whether they want to live in a dictatorship or in a democracy, they always chose democracy. In 1906, in the election to the First State Duma, which was won by the Constitutional Democrats, a leading pro-Western, pro-reform party, and the far-right parties that supported the Tsarist autocracy failed to win a single seat. In 1917, in the election to the Constituent Assembly that we discussed yesterday during the first panel, when the Bolshevik usurpers, with their proposal of a dictatorship of the proletariat, were soundly defeated by the SR party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party that advocated for a democratic parliamentary republic in Russia. Or in 1991, when pro-democracy leader Boris Yeltsin defeated the Communist Party candidate in the Russian presidential election by 57% to 17%. These are the facts, not stereotypes. And at the risk of stating the obvious, I'm still going to say that the regime of Vladimir Putin is not a product of a democratic choice by the Russian people. It has come to power by a backroom deal of the elites, and it is holding on to power by artificially eliminating any meaningful competition. It's not difficult to win if your opponents are not actually on the ballot. And in most Russian elections, beginning at least in 2008, any genuine opposition to the Kremlin was removed from the ballot ahead of the vote, before the vote even began. This will be the case once again next March in the upcoming so-called presidential election of March 2018. Two prominent opposition leaders were planning to run against Vladimir Putin. The first was former Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov, and the second was anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny. Boris Nemtsov will not run because in February of 2015 he was killed on a bridge in front of the Kremlin. And Navalny will not run because he was disenfranchised by the current Russian authorities with a politically motivated court conviction. I think it's also important to state that every time the genuine opposition was actually present on the ballot, it achieved significant results, such as Navalny's nearly 30% of the vote in the Moscow mayoral election in 2013, such as Boris Nemtsov's victory in the election to the Yaroslavl regional parliament also in 2013, when he became the first non-systemic opposition leader in Russia to actually win an election and become an elected legislator. Or just 2 months ago, in September of 2017, with the election of nearly 300 democratic opposition lawmakers in the Moscow municipal election. And this despite all the other handicaps, well-known handicaps, of the election system as it exists in Russia today, with a lack of a level playing field, the lack of access to the media, and in many cases, the lack of an honest vote count itself. Stating the obvious once again, a government that really has 86% support, which is the figure we hear most often from Putin's official pollsters, would not need to rig elections. He would not need to censor the media. He would not need to harass or imprison its opponents. This is the behavior of a regime that is uncertain and insecure. And looking at the mass protests that have begun across Russia earlier this year, I think the regime has reason to be uncertain and insecure. In the spring, and again over the summer of this year, 2017, tens of thousands of Russians, predominantly young Russians, went to the streets all across the country to voice their protest against the pervasive corruption and the political conditions that have allowed for this corruption, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the lack of a rule of law, the impunity and the sheer arrogance of the same small group of people that has now held power in our country for nearly 2 decades. In fact, a significant number of those protesters have never lived under anything except the Putin regime. Many of them are in late teens, early 20s, they're university students, they're high school students, they're young professionals. They were certainly raised and in many cases born under Vladimir Putin. And yet it is that generation that is increasingly beginning to say enough. These protests took part in more than 200 towns and cities across Russia, which is a new thing for us, by the way, because usually all the political activities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is more than 200 towns and cities, literally from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, across 11 time zones. And these peaceful protesters were met with threats and with warnings and with police batons and with beatings and with mass arrests. But they came, and then they came back again, and they will be back again. Because I think for many of these young people, Andrew mentioned this famous quote by Augustine about the thought and the fear. For many of these young people, their self-awareness as citizens of their own country who want dignity and who want respect from their own state is gradually becoming stronger than fear. And I think this is a very important moment. I think the best guarantee of a democracy, any democracy, are the citizens who maintain it. And this emerging, predominantly young, national movement for transparency and for the rule of law in Russia that we're seeing emerge in front of our eyes, I think it is the best guarantee that Russia will one day take its rightful place among the free nations. And it's also the best kind of repudiation of that tired, old, and false stereotype that Russians are somehow uniquely unsuited to living in a free society. So, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. I look forward to the discussion after.
Thank you, Vladimir. I think I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up. I think it's particularly interested in the change in generations and what that implies. I think that's been coming. I can't resist, though, just one little aside, because you started with Lubyanka, the Dzerzhinsky monument, when it came down. I went into Moscow right after, as it was coming down, and I actually asked for an interview in the Lubyanka and KGB, and much to my astonishment, they invited me in. I did not want to be invited in a previous era, and I was brought in, and this KGB bureaucrat I was trying to figure out why did they agree to this. Well, it became very clear after the failed putsch, they wanted to explain how the KGB had been on the side of Yeltsin, the protesters, and were putting down this push, and that this was going to be a whole new KGB now, or FSB as it soon became. And I listened to this whole spiel about, he said, we're so different now and so forth. And then I just asked him one question. I said, how long have you worked in this building? And he said, 35 years. Thank you very much. Mark?
Can I just very quickly respond to that with a story that Vladimir Kara-Murza was told me? He was once at a conference in Prague. This was, I think, at the beginning of the 90s. And they sat down for a coffee. It was Vladimir Kara-Murza. It was Radek Sikorski, who was a member of Solidarity in Poland, who was recently the foreign minister of Poland, and it was Alexander Yakovlev, the number 2 in Gorbachev's Politburo. So Yakovlev was telling him about how, a lot of the people in the Politburo, in the Central Committee, they understood everything about the Soviet system. They were all against it, really. And then when the conversation finished, Yakovlev left, and Radek turned to Bukovsky and said, just as I knew, the whole Soviet Union was run by anti-communists. So he says, this goes a little bit to the same. They very quickly turned themselves. I think we'll find that again the next time things change in Russia.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you. Mark?
Thanks very much, and delighted to be here. And in fact, I actually want to pick up straight away from this last point. Of course, it's absolutely true that we cannot and should not and must not generalize about Russians, that they're somehow, their DNA is naturally forged into shackles. Always mistrust these kind of broad generalizations, the same ones that tell you that Germans will always be militarists or whatever. Not least because these are frequently music to the ears of authoritarians and ideologues, because they somehow say there can be no change. If there can be no change, there can be no hope. And if there is no hope, then what is the point of trying to do anything different? The fact is there is always hope. And we see this with Russians, not just currently in terms of the sort of that's where the headline political protests, which Vladimir talked about, but also, I mean, there is a massive and often unsung tale about low-level activism, often on very, very specific issues, ecology, corruption, failure to provide basic public services, that people do indeed mobilize all around the country. And I said, because it's wildcat strikes, it's low-level civic activism, it's not the kind of thing that often we notice, but it absolutely is there. And it demonstrates that this is a country, a people who absolutely do want change. However, as you can tell from the accent, I'm from the UK, and therefore I am an unashamed elitist. And that's precisely the complementary point that I want to talk about. Not just, as it were, the pressure from below. I've just completed writing a book on Russian organized crime, and as part of that, I spent a couple of months reading every single Gulag memoir I could lay my hands on, which, as you can imagine, is a very light-hearted time of my life. But one of the things that really was extraordinarily striking was that even in those extraordinary, murderously miserable conditions, nonetheless, people were still willing to protest, to strike, to riot, despite the fact that they basically knew what would face them, that they knew the kind of response they would get. I mean, in, for example, the 1954 Steplag protests, when the Soviet authorities actually went in, I mean, literally tanks crushed the prisoners who were trying to kind of hold the barricade beneath their treads. But people still did it. And the interesting thing is that the wave of strikes and protests, as well as the sort of internecine conflicts within certain elements of the convicts in that time, in the 1950s, actually succeeded. I won't say that the Soviet Union was no longer a carceral society, but basically around this time, the Gulag system began to be wound down. And it wasn't just because Stalin died, though that provided a kind of convenient pretext. It certainly wasn't because of the humanitarianism of the Soviet elite. In fact, the first advocate for actually diminishing the Gulag population was Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's last and nastiest secret police chief. It was rather just simply that a cynical and pragmatic elite had come to realize that, in fact, the Gulag system no longer made sense. A multi-million strong slave population, unhappy, unskilled, was no longer what the Soviet economy needed. No one wanted to be out stranded in the far north or the far east, managing these mills of murder and mayhem. So instead, what we actually saw was a scaling down of the Gulag system. Again, I mean, we have to accept that we are talking in terms of relative levels of barbarity, but nonetheless, by 1960, the size of the Gulags was only a fraction of what it had been before. And I think this is for me one of the interesting engines of change when societies do change. It's because you need to have both elements. You need to have a population which is willing to struggle, which is willing to push and to press and to demand change. But you also ultimately, I wouldn't say necessarily need, but it is exceedingly advantageous to have an elite that sees its own interests in acknowledging the need for some kind of change. That is generally how change works. We would like to believe the historic model, that it all comes bubbling up from the bottom. But to an extent, it also comes down from above. Now, by training and inclination, I'm a historian, so I'm allowed to think in the very long term. And I am unfashionably optimistic about Russia. I don't believe that there will be change quickly or dramatically. But I do think we can see signs that even the elite, even an elite which has done so well under Putin and has, frankly, robbed this country and its people blind, even there we can begin to see some kind of signs of, if not a desire, but at least a grudging willingness to think about change, think about real change and reform. There's a metaphor that was used by a Russian sort of legalist in 1914, anyway, Vasily Maklakov, who was speaking for many within the Tsarist Russian elite when he drew forward this parable that, you know, imagine you're in a car and the brakes don't work and you're trying to negotiate narrow, winding mountain roads, cliff on one side above, precipice on the other. And you suddenly realize that the driver has gone mad. Now, do you try and wrench the steering wheel from the driver, fully aware that in the conflict, the struggle, you may well plummet off into the precipice? Or do you just sit back, hope and pray that you make it to the lowlands where you're safer, and then you can start to think about it? Well, I'm actually of the opinion that this very much represents the view of many within the current Russian elite. Putin represents, I would suggest, a specific historic moment. And in part, what Putin represents, and this brings it to, back to precisely the sort of the subject of this thing. I mean, he is a communist without communism. He is Homo Sovieticus. He is clearly, a product of the values, the norms, and the methods of the communist regime, uncoupled from any nonsense about Marxism and Leninism. And yet combined also with the unfettered kleptocracy that we have seen emerge. Not that late Soviet era was a time of keen moral rectitude. And as a third element, that kind of toxic post-imperial sense. And again, as a Brit, we understand that it's hard to lose an empire. We haven't quite got over it 60 years on. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that under much less positive conditions, nor have the Russians. But it's still at that very toxic zero-sum game of where did it all go, but more to the point, who took it from us? I mean, these three elements, the communist, shall I say, skill set and mindset, the kleptocratic self-interest, and that sort of particularly vicious form of nationalism, product of this sense that we have been, basically we've had our birthright stolen. Now that is something that has, in some ways, come to consume him. If one looks at early Putin in his first two terms, no one would say he was a nice chap. Well, actually, someone certainly sort of looked into his eyes and saw his soul and thought otherwise, but I think in hindsight, certainly no one would say he's a nice chap. But nonetheless, he was, in many ways, very pragmatic in his policy. He looked to create some kind of modus vivendi with the West. He didn't want to create a Western liberal democratic society or anything like that, of course not. But there was that sense that there was some kind of common ground potentially available. Well, that has fallen away. And like almost all authoritarian leaders, he has become, over time, a caricature of himself. He has surrounded himself more and more clearly with people who just simply echo back to him what he expects to hear. He has excluded from his circle any who might challenge his opinions and his prejudices. And we now have a Putin who is clearly committed to his own historic role to make Russia great again, shall we say. And in that context, he is willing to, as it were, fight that fight, not just to the last ordinary Russian, but also for the expense of the majority of the elite. There is a handful of people who are closest to him who are continuing to be thoroughly feather-bedded and protected, but others within the elite who genuinely feel that actually their interests are at risk. And so I think what we're now beginning to see is their own awareness of something that has happened, which has been the complete deinstitutionalization of Russia. Russia has become essentially controlled, not by one man. I mean, if nothing else, Putin actually is increasingly also lazy, detached from the day-to-day business of running the country. But ultimately, he is the final source of all authority. His presidential administration is the most important structure running this country. Everyone else is just there to follow orders and make a bit of money on the side beyond that. The problem with that is obviously it gives people within the elite, people who are now rich and powerful, absolutely no security. The currency of Russia is not the ruble, it is not the dollar, it is not the euro, it is political favor. And you can have that today, but have someone else have more of it tomorrow. You can be rich today and a convict tomorrow. This is one of the reasons why they love the old model whereby you can steal at home and then send your money to be safe in the West. And indeed send your family there as well. Well, that's becoming harder and harder. The state is beginning to push back against that. The fact of the matter is property rights. Property rights are the only thing that will actually make that elite safe. And that cannot coexist with this extraordinarily sort of vicious, authoritarian and unconstrained structure. Now, do I think that these people are becoming aware of the importance of democratic structures and so forth? No, not really. These people are ruthless pragmatists. However, they are also highly cosmopolitan. They are also people who actually are beginning, in my opinion, to come to be aware of the fact that actually elites tend to be swept away not by democracy, but by the lack of democracy. That actually democracy is what allows rich people to enjoy being rich and leave the boring business of government to a political class. I think that is beginning to emerge. I think precisely the fact that Putin is now seems absolutely dead set on some kind of, I wouldn't say apocalyptic, because I don't want to sort of make it too much, but nonetheless clearly some kind of civilizational struggle with the West that does not fit with their interests. Are they going to start anything? No, because if Putin understands one thing, it is power. So long as Putin is in the Kremlin, I do not believe that people within the elite will try and do anything about it. Unless, of course, they begin to feel that their interests have suffered. We saw a communist, quote-unquote, elite reinvent itself in 1991 and do very, very well for itself in the main. I'm sure they would have no problem in doing the same, once again, reinventing themselves as democrats. The challenge then, and I'll end on this point, the challenge then is to ensure that when that happens, and the current situation is not sustainable, it is not sustainable economically, it is not sustainable socially, it is not sustainable demographically, it is not sustainable in any terms. When that system does break, whether it's because Putin thinks he's found a successor who may not be quite as loyal as he thinks, or if mortality catches up with Putin, or I don't know if you can overload from Botox or not, but who knows quite what fate will bring. There will come a transition. The crucial point then for Russia and for Russia's friends is to ensure that this time the lessons of 1991 are learned. And again, this kind of loops back to the points that Vladimir was making. This time that it is actually institutionalized. We do not put faith in promises, in the right person, but actually in the institutions which are so crucial to a modern democratic liberal society. Thank you.
Mark, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark and Arkady.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here in this building and in Washington. I must say that I was born and grew up in the Soviet Union as Vladimir, and a little older than Vladimir. And I must say that as every 7th of November, my brother and I sat in Moscow. The weather is usually not nearly as pleasant as here. This time of the year, it's already dark, it's raining, it's kind of really quite miserable. The winter is coming, and it's going to last for 6-7 months. The 7th of November was kind of a day, it was a day off. It was the day of the Bolshevik Revolution, and it was the day the main entertainment was sitting on the floor and watching the Soviet parade on the day of, marking the great October Socialist Revolution. And the parades are, for kids and boys particularly, great fun. I must say that I could have probably imagined, we had a pretty wild imagination. I could have imagined many things. The idea that 100 years from the Bolshevik Revolution, I would be marking the event standing on top of the memorial foundation, the victims of communism, looking at the Capitol Hill, did not cross my mind, which actually does tell you something about history, in a sense that history does have its irony, and history is much cleverer than we are, than actors are, than those who think they can determine it, be it Marx, be it Putin, be it President Donald Trump, that history has more facts at its disposal and has tendency to surprise, as Russia has learned many times over the past century and beyond. It's also great to be in the Library of Congress, and I think it is very symbolic, actually, that this event is taking place here, because in one of the greatest libraries of the world, because control of books, control of thought, control of print, control of word were the things with which the Bolsheviks had started, taking over the print presses, taking over nationalizing newspapers, inventing a new language, the Newsweek, and limiting the books and making the first blacklists of the books that were not to be issued to people, not to be read. The first blacklists of books, by the way, were compiled by Nadezhda Krupskaya, by Lenin's wife. In 1930s, librarians in the Soviet Union were arrested and sent to Gulag for letting readers take books which were not even banned, but which were unwise to read, philosophical works. So the fact that we're in the library makes full sense, and it's the ability of the Bolsheviks to control the thought that actually made them last that long. But because of that, I would like to be as provocative as possible and challenge some of the things which are common, assumed and sort of wisdom. And given that I work for The Economist, I don't think I could, I will try to defend communism. This is a great foundation, and it's a great event. I have problem with 2 words in the title. One word is victims, and the other word is communism. Otherwise, it's fine. Why? The problem with victims is a very serious one. Russia, as Vladimir said, had not been through the process of examination of history, let alone repentance. There has been no illustration. One of the first and most important institutions set up with the help of Andrei Sakharov and Arseny Raginsky, a Russian historian memorial, never achieved what it set out to achieve. It never really brought the country to face what happened. I had a conversation with Arseny Raginsky, a Soviet dissident, a brilliant historian, a man who dedicated his life to the memory of Gulag, the study of Gulag, the study of the Bolshevik regime. I asked him what happened. Why did this most important institution, why did it actually not being able to achieve this most important task of facing to the past, which Germany had done with the help of the Allied forces being defeated. Japan had done to a certain extent, not as fully as Germany. Russia had not. And it was not just the Soviet victory in the Second World War. And Raginsky gave me an answer which was very honest, I think very brave and very disturbing. He said the reason this has not happened is that an act of repentance would demand a question of whose fault this was. Who was the guilty party? And the true answer to that would be everyone. When 20 million die, they don't die executed by aliens landing from Mars. They got executed by their countrymen. And that is the very disturbing thought, and it's I think one of the main reasons why Russia has never quite come to terms with its past, because it was not an act of just repression or by an alien regime. It was an act of mass self-suicide and self-destruction that Russia engaged in. The second word I have a problem with, and I'll bring it to the present, don't worry, is communism. Who are the communists? And why is this communism so lasting? I mean, I'm a British citizen, as well as a Russian citizen. I live in London. We're about to have a communist government, I think, if we're not careful. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, is one of the staunchest supporters of the communist idea. So it's a teaching that there is a wonderful book, which I wholeheartedly recommend, which is probably one of the best and most significant books on the history of the Soviet ideology and communism by Russian-American historian Yuri Slyoskin, called The House of the Government. It's 1,000 pages long, but it's very well written, which treats communism and Bolshevism as a form, as a sect, as a religious sect, as millenarianism. Probably the most successful millenarian sect in history that managed to bring the Day of Judgment within their own lifetimes. But who were the communists? Was the communists just again, sort of a repressive bunch of the Bolsheviks? If so, was Vasily Grossman, the man who chronicled, who wrote Life and Fate, probably one of the most significant books about Stalinism and its relationship to Nazism, was he a communist? He worked for Pravda newspaper. He worked for the Red Star newspaper. He was a war correspondent. He published in Pravda. Was Alexander Yakovlev a communist? The man who was number two, I would say, actually, in terms of the philosophy and ideology of perestroika, number one in opening up the media and starting perestroika in the Soviet Union, the man who rehabilitated hundreds of thousands of people, the man who himself embarked on a process of repentance, even when the country hadn't, and completed it. Was Alexander Dubček a communist in the 60s when he tried the socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia? Or Zdeněk Mlynář, who was his close ally and a friend and a roommate of Mikhail Gorbachev? Was Gorbachev himself a communist man, who in fact was guided by the ideas of socialist principles as he understood them, and believed that socialism could be achieved without two of its sort of real pillars, repression and lies and propaganda, and tried to remove both, and with it buried the Soviet Union, but did so in the hope to revive socialism and communism, not to bury it. These are very complex and important, I believe, important questions. Finally, was Yeltsin a communist? He was, and he was the man who buried the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, and banned it in the end. Why these questions are important? It's exactly because some of the traits keep reappearing. And one of the reasons they keep reappearing, not just in Russia but worldwide, is that communism has never been studied, that our understanding of communism also been sort of colored by ideology rather than serious historical examination. And this is one thing that Russia has never done. In 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet legacy has been just rejected. Completely, all the Soviet kind of stuff became a subject of jokes. I remember a fun television program in the early 90s where a rock star and a very popular TV presenter had a kind of a first fake news, fake kind of program, a spoof, on the day of the Bolshevik Revolution where they called Lenin a mushroom, where it was a fun program and Lenin was a mushroom and one of them tried to prove that he was a mushroom and build this crazy theory and everybody laughed at it. And it was fun, everybody pulled, fun and made fun and mockery of the Soviet period and the Soviet civilization, which by the way was a civilization with its own complexities. There was a newspaper, the leading newspaper of the early 90s, a newspaper called Kommersant. On its masthead, it said, this newspaper did not come out between the years of, it was established in 1909 and did not come out between years of 1917 and 1991 for reasons outside editorial control.
Still does say that.
Still does say that. What it was a serious message in that. And the message was, we can just cut out this period as totally irrelevant and alien to modern Russia, and we will make a miraculous reconnection. We'll, cut out a piece of the pipe, and we'll connect the two ends, say, circa 1913 and 1991. The result of this sort of cutting out of the Soviet period was that it actually, just as easily as it was cut out, it could be put back, which is exactly what Vladimir Putin tried to do. Putin is not a communist or anti-communist. He believes in the empire. He, for reasons of his own convenience, doesn't mark the Bolshevik Revolution, not because he doesn't believe in communism, but because revolutions is an interruptive event. It's a dramatic event that breaks a continuum, what he sees a continuum of Russian history. There was a country called Russian Empire. It was then called the Soviet Union. Now there is Russian Federation, but ultimately it's the same country. The reason this, again, questions are so important is that it would be a big mistake, just as it was then, to portray the country as alien forces repressing the Russian people, and Russia then getting freed and becoming, as Andrew said, a normal country. Unless we understand the mechanisms that are involved, we will repeat the same mistake again and again. It would be just wrong today to say that the regime of Vladimir Putin is a new version of Stalinism, that it's a repressive regime, that Russians are free-loving people being repressed by a nasty government, and as soon as we remove them, just as we remove the Communist Party, Russian people will gladly embrace Western liberal values and come rushing to the West. We've made that mistake once in 91. We shouldn't make that again. To the question of can Russians be free? Russians are free. Russia, over the past 25 years, and that's a quote, the past 25 years, despite the curtailing of some political and civil freedoms, has been the freest in Russian history. These are not the words of Vladimir Putin. These are the words of Alexei Navalny, an opposition leader and a real challenger now to President Putin, who does risk his life, who has been physically assaulted, who spends a lot of his time in jail. And he still believes that the Russians are free. And he also believes that Putin is not some sort of a czar, and Putin is not some sort of a general secretary, that he refuses effectively to recognize that he is a legitimate president. And the Russians are free. Russians are free to travel, to shop, to get information from the internet, to watch the CNN on the BBC. The Russians are free also to embrace the lies of Russian state television channels. And Russians are free to cheer the annexation of Crimea, as they have done. Bertolt Brecht, a great German playwright, anti-Nazi playwright, once said that Germans were deceived because Germans wanted to be deceived. The unfortunate truth is that Russian propaganda works in Russia, not because the television channels are so brilliant, but because it tells people something, on the whole, they want to hear. It works, propaganda only works if people want to believe it. Examining what Russia is, and Russia is not a reincarnation of communism, although the two pillars, the threat of repression and the lies, have been reinstated. It is true in modern Russia. But it's a very complex system, which is not unique, in fact. Putin, I'm not going to talk about Putin legitimacy in 86%, although it's a complicated question because, yes, this is not the result of the election, but this 86% is not fake either. It's not the active support, but it is a recognition of him as effectively having some form of legitimacy, be it Tsar's legitimacy or authoritarian legitimacy, whatever. But the system that Russia is today is not unique by any stretch of imagination and has been described by political scientists and historians over the years. A great American Nobel Prize-winning economist, Douglas North, described these systems as limited access system, or natural states, where access to resources, political and economic, is limited to the elite. This is sort of a patron-client relationships where informal, as Mark described, informal links are much more important than institutions. The fact that Russia doesn't have property rights is not some sort of aberration. It's actually part of the system. It's a necessary part of the system of redistributing rents. Yeah, so I'm just wrapping up. So it's basically a transition, and North also call these things natural state. And the reason they're natural is they're very long-lasting and stable, and they're very, very hard to transform into open access orders, which is, the West is an example of. And actually, most of Western countries only did it after the war. We don't fully understand the mechanism, how it happens. Yes, Putin could go. Putin could die tomorrow. The importance of the random factor is enormous in Russia today, which is what Putin and his elite have done, pushed the country into the corner. But that doesn't mean that that mechanism of rent-seeking and rent redistribution, closed system, use of repression is going to be dismantled with it. And we should be ready for a long transition. And unless we understand the mechanisms of what the communism was based on, and unless we understand how today's Russia works, we will keep getting surprised. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arkady.